Hey guys, happy belated Batman Day. We're going to be talking about the 90s animated Batman series as part of my series on Batman in other media. I had previously done a video about this, but unfortunately that video and other Batman videos no longer exist because they were lost when I lost my previous computer. Been meaning to reshoot them, but just never got around it. And since this weekend was Batman Day, I thought I'd finally get a chance to do this. Now, I've previously talked about the Filmation Batman series, which preceded this. Those were in the 60s and mid-70s, and of course Batman showed up in the Super Friends animated series. Batman would go on to appear in other animated series, The Batman and Brave and the Bold, etc. But this is by far the most well-known animated series about Batman, and, probably one of the best. But before I go into this a little bit, let's remember our time frame. In June of 1989, on the 19th, Batman, directed by Tim Burton, with Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson, had come out in theaters. Later, Batman Returns came out in June of 1992. Both have, as I've again talked about in another video, blending of 30s Batman, 80s Batman, a mix of film noir. We have this sort of 30s setting with modern day things. So we have a sort of blending of time periods, a sort of anachronistic time period, and again, without these two, you never would have had this series. It's always important to remember that, especially now in our post Nolan Batman world and so on. It's important to remember what this brought us and the aesthetic that it set up and the look, the feel that it set up, because you would not have this without that. Because this very much picks up, blending of the 30s and the, 80s, and there's a lot of 70s Batman, in this as well. I mean, as we know, with the 70s and 60s, we had, Batman of that time period being more lighthearted. But once the Adam West show was off the air, we got more serious Batman, and darker stories, and him as a vigilante more, and Robin's gone off to college, and more darker tone Batman stories. Joker did not appear right away. Same for a lot of the more quote unquote campy Batman villains, but they would appear up later on with Dennis O'Neil pretty much recreating them in a much darker way. So you got to see characters that had not been around for a long while, such as Two-Face, excuse me, who had not appeared since the 50s. And, we have, this return to much darker roots of Batman, from the 70s and 80s and of course the 90s, and this series very much picks up on that. So with the we have elements of, like, say, the 30s and 40s Batman, where he was much darker, as well as the 70s and 80s Batman, which also was very dark. Now, this series had premiered on September 6, 1992. So, this movie, Batman Returns, again, it came out in June. Just before this series had come out, and it's hard to remember now, but episodes came out more slower than we think. That's because of the nature of the way the series was made. It's just one of those things. And, for a while we would just get repeats, and finally, once in a while, a new episode. And maybe that's part of how this series endures, with so many repeats that... at the time period, it'd be like, oh, okay, I've seen this before. I'll watch it again, sure. I kind of wish it was a new episode, but that's just the way it was at the time period. So this came out in September of 1992, and at first, Robin only appears a couple of times, and it's Dick Grayson, but he's wearing the Tim Drake Robin outfit. Which at that time period was the Robin was wearing it in comics, so they probably went with that because it was more familiar, and because they were trying to get away from the Robin in little pixie boots and undies and so on. And again, we have here Batman is alone, Batman working on his own. And we have the 30s aesthetic, we have the 80s aesthetic of Batman with this series. We have the film noir aspects, and lots of other things. I really love that this series was drawn on black paper, so that it all has a very darkish look. Colors really come out, and it has a very unique look. I like how the animation looked at the beginning of this series. Not so much later on, but I'll get to that. But here you can see a few images here of just how this series looked, and how it came about. So, the very first episode was Leather Wings, which as I showed, which showed an animated version of Man-Bat, which again I think is significant because he was the most significant character to come about when again the 60s Adam West had ended, and the 60s Batman comics have run down, and the 70s was just starting out. He was the first new character to appear at that time in comics, and and he was also the most recurring at that time period. So it's only natural that we start off the series with Man-Bat. Now, Joker would make his first appearance in Christmas with the Joker, voiced by Mark Hamill, and again, as with Kevin Conroy for the voice of Batman, we have Mark Hamill doing the voice of Joker. There have been other versions, but these are the ones that everybody thinks about when we think about Batman and the Joker, and with good reason. And I would say this is the longest series with Batman in it. Longer than Adam West or any other Batman series that would come about. And I'm not counting Gotham with good reason, because I hate Gotham and I'm glad it's in it. But anyways, that's a whole other thing. So anyways, we have Catwoman, as you see, appear up very rarely, which I actually was kind of surprised with, considering how popular a character she was in the movie. But she only rarely shows up in the animated series. More, again, you can see here, comic more or less in line with how she looked during the 80s. A bit more gray here, as you can see, with the color shot. But, she was a very good character. They try to make her more sympathetic. But I enjoyed her few appearances. And we would get various characters who had been in the comics, but not seen as frequently. And again, I think that's also in tone with how 70s and 80s Batman was. So we get Poison Ivy in Pretty Poison, who had appeared in at first in the 60s and off and on during the 70s, but she was always kind of a off and on Batman villain. I think this series has a lot to do with her popularity, with how she was portrayed and how she comes off. We have also the Penguin, who is voiced by Paul Williams. And the look is going with Danny DeVito, minus the more, I suppose you would say, disgusting elements of the character. But in terms of Paul Williams' performance, I would say it's very much Penguin of the comics in terms of the 30s and 40s when he originally appeared. And at that time period, he was the number 2 Batman villain after the Joker, because he appeared so many times. And for, that time period, he really works as a Batman villain. He's sort of the gentleman thief and so on. And, I really enjoy Paul Williams' performance. Actually, I'm probably one of the few people who likes I Have Batman in My Basement. I think it's a very enjoyable episode. A lot of times when people talk about this series, they cite that episode as one of their least favorite. But I actually quite enjoy the episode and how it plays out. It's a kid who wants to be a detective and whatnot, and idolizes Batman, who wants to, work out in his own neighborhood. He's, teased and whatnot. And then he meets his idol, who's knocked out, and he has to protect him and so on. I kind of like those aspects. I enjoy them. Apparently a lot of people don't, but whatever. Now, this series, we would get Two-Face, who, again, as with the 70s and 80s, is a much darker version. Although I would say he has a much more interesting origin story. Here you can have a better look of, Catwoman's gray costume and, other color images of the series. And at the bottom we have this Two-Face. I like how this version is done. It's sort of picking up off of Eye of the Beholder, which had already established that Harvey Dent was kind of already going off the deep end there. He just hadn't gotten there yet, and the being hit by acid and so on, is what finally pushes him over the edge. Which is something that their versions, such as the movie The Dark Knight, would pick up on. So again, elements of the story Eye of the Beholder are, kind of referenced, but not relied upon. And a lot of these episodes would, use references to older stories, but not always adapt them or rely upon them. But it would be in tone with them. And I think that's what's important of this series. It shows how Batman history is, from 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. It's all here. We do have episodes that either can be a little bit silly or lighthearted or, dare I say, campy. Maybe not over the top with that, but they would be there once in a while. Overall, we would have the more serious and, darker toned Batman stories. But anyways, we have Two-Face, and Harvey Dent was shown a couple of episodes early on as district attorney, and finally going over the deep end. He already has the split personality. It's just the accident that finally drives him over the edge. We see that, he was friends with Bruce Wayne, and, a very good friend. Previously in comics, he was just a, friend of Batman. You can see here, Penguin here. But anyways, he was friends with Bruce Wayne and very close to him. So, and it's very heartbreaking to Batman to see his friend go this way. And he's out to get Rupert Thorne, who was a villain in the mid-80s. We also have Heart of Ice. Now, as I previously talked about, the Adam West series took the one-shot 50s villain, Mr. Zero, and gave him a new name, Mr. Freeze. Shortly after appearing in this episode, he would appear in comics heavily based off of the Adam West appearance. Now, this series would give him a new origin and much, dare I say, cooler origin. We would get in a flashback of Mr. Zero, of his origin, and in the Adam West series, his origin would only be referenced rather than shown. Here we get a more in-depth origin and the creation of Nora Freeze. And, it's probably one of the best Mr. Freeze stories in the entire series. I'll talk about his second and most important series a little bit later. But again, this is his most significant story and would later be adapted into comics and become official canon. And that's the thing I really want to show with this series about Batman and other media, of how non-comic versions influence the comics. And we see that definitely here with Mr. Freeze, and, how his story here influences the comics. He's uncharacteristic laughing here, but I think that's to pick up off of a later movie, but whatever. Anyways, the way he's depicted here, and the way his origin is shown here, is very influential with the comics. And I think that's very important, because I think it's very interesting of how these non-comic book mediums influence comics, such as we see here, Batman, a little bit with Superman, and so on. So that is something else that this series brought about. We would have, various appearances of Scarecrow, and they would work on how he looks. We have, Clayface, which was a very good villain. I think they did him very well. He had previously appeared in the 70s version of the Batman series. And, we would have a few appearances from Riddler. Sadly, not as many. They confessed they couldn't think of as many stories with him, which I think is a shame. I think the Adam West series does the most with Riddler, and is probably one of the best Riddler appearances. And it's interesting also how a character appears much more in a non-comic book medium than he would in comics. Such as, Adam West Riddler. Previously, he only appeared 3 times in comics. And, for the first season, had 4 2-part stories. One appearance by a different actor in the second season, appeared in the movie. And once for an episode in the third series. And throughout the 60s, would appear now and again, not quite as often, and a little bit during the 70s and 80s. Not as popular later on, because people think of Riddler as more campy, and they associate him very heavily with the Adam West Batman series, which I can understand. So, that's just one example of a character appearing more on like something that isn't a comic than he would in actual comics. And, I find that, highly interesting. That he's significant in a one version, but not so much in the actual print. Not just something like, say, Riddler, but various other characters you see that with. And we also get, various other characters we would get, a little bit nods to Joker, not Joker, excuse me, Bruce Wayne's past. Not as much, but, little bits and pieces, little images we wouldn't actually see, how his parents were gunned down, something that Super Friends actually was able to do, and quite well. We also would get Joker's Favor, which introduced Harley Quinn, and it goes without saying how much this character influenced comics, especially now. Here, whenever we talk about a character from one medium transitioning to another, we reference Harley Quinn, but as I point out, that's, long before Harley Quinn came about, I point out specifically Mr. Freeze, but there are various characters who have integrated from one medium to the other, or the medium is influenced by, something that is not in comics. And Harley Quinn is just one great example. Now, in December of 1993, on the 25th, we got the animated movie Mask of the Phantasm, and this was actually shown in theaters. It was not direct to DVD at first. It was not as popular, and I think that's very much a marketing thing. It was not well marketed, and which is a shame. And this deals a lot more with Bruce Wayne's past. Again, we don't see the event in Crime Alley, but more of this series version of how Bruce Wayne is kind of starting out. Sort of this version of Batman Year One, more or less. And how, Bruce Wayne is starting out, and what he is finally deciding to do in order to become Batman. And how he transitions into that character, and how Alfred is sort of shocked, how he's kind of losing someone he knows and is becoming something else. We have his brief engagement and how that's eventually called off. We have a new character, more or less, called the Phantasm, which is heavily referenced from Batman Year 2 character, the Reaper. Not overly relying on that character, but, certainly in terms of visuals, referencing that character, different, version, if you will, of the character. Never called the Phantasm on screen, but is on, as you see with the title. And of course, we have an appearance with the Joker, and a Joker beforehand. He's never referenced as who he is. He would be called Jack Napier, as he was in the Tim Burton movie and a few episodes off and on, and that's probably the only other time that we would get the Joker's name in a medium, other than the Tim Burton movie. And again, the name Jack Napier is a play on the word jackanapes. So, which is sort of older version of sort of a comical person who's playing pranks and whatnot, which is in line with what the Joker is. So that name is integrated into this show. It wouldn't be often that he would be referenced as Jack Napier, but it would appear off and on. Anyways, here we have, a different villain, And very good anime movies. This is probably one of my favorite of the anime movies, along with Under the Red Hood and various others. And, as the series continued off and on, we get new characters, new versions. We get a little bit more of Clayface, we get Killer Croc. Only brief appearances by, Riddler and Catwoman. We would get a new villain in terms with the Ninja, as you see here, who appeared only twice, and I think it's very significant that his first appearance is Night of the Ninja, and then we have his second appearance is Day of the Samurai. Night being ninja working in the dark. Batman is more in terms of a samurai working. He's part of the light, even though he works, during night. But it definitely a high contrast of terms of what these two characters are. We would get a lot more appearances of Robin, and that was partly because they knew at the time he was going to be in movies. So we get his origin story with Robin's Reckoning, and it does very well how his parents are killed and what happens there. And they do that in a very subtle way and a very interesting way. We would also get episodes such as Laughing Fish, which is actually combining two different Joker stories. One is Joker's Five-Way Revenge, the other is, of course, the two-part Laughing Fish. The main story is pulling off from Laughing Fish, where Joker has poisoned fish to give them the Joker smile, and he wants to copyright them. One of his most outlandish schemes. So the beginning of the episode is pulling from that comic book story. The ending comes from Five-Way Revenge, where the Joker is putting Batman into a tank with a shark. That there's a similarity between the Joker and the shark with the big, smile. We would also get episodes such as one of my personal favorites, Heart of Steel. Another episode a lot of people don't like, but I highly enjoy. And I actually like it because it's going with, this series, as with the Tim Burton movies, is very Art Deco. So Heart of Steel is paying tribute to two specific movies that are very influential with Art Deco. The first is the silent movie Metropolis by Fritz Lang. The second is, of course, Blade Runner. But both movies have this theme of robots and, replicants, whatever, and the, questioning what humanity and so on. And that plays, I think Heart of Steel is very much, acknowledging that. Because if you're going to have a series of Art Deco Batman, it's only right to reference Metropolis and Blade Runner and to pay tribute to them. In point of fact, the character of Rossum, who gets his name from the play Rossum's Robots, the actor plays, one of the guys in Blade Runner, one of the creators that one of the replicants goes to. He's the more pathetic guy who makes his own friends, which in point of fact is referenced in Rossum's second appearance in the animated series. In fact, we get a cameo nod to Mixoplex, and we get this series version of Batmite, who is a robot, who wants to help, and of course he breaks down, which is sort of a nice little campy nod to the character. And Heart of Steel also introduces Barbara Gordon before she's Batgirl, because this series wanted to establish Barbara Gordon before she becomes, Batgirl. And I think it does it very well. And, so I think it's a very significant episode. I highly enjoy it, even if a lot of people don't. We get a lot of other stories, a little bit more of, Scarecrow, Poison Ivy showing up. She would have significant team up with Harley and Harley's second appearance, thus starting their, sort of relationship. Here and there, appearances by Catwoman, sadly not too many. Again, Robin showing up more often. Now that he's off and on out of college. And we would also get Ra's al Ghul, who is the second most interesting character to come out of the 70s and 80s. And he's voiced by David Warner. And here, I think it's, as we have with Conroy and Mark Hamill being the, quintessential voices, I think David Warner is the quintessential voice for, Ra's al Ghul. And here we see him at the bottom here. He would appear in a cameo appearance introducing Talia, and so on. And, he was a major villain. Not really one of my favorites, and I think that's because it kind of takes Batman out of his established universe. And they kind of already did that during the 70s, 80s of him fighting the League of Assassins, which at that time was not run by Ra's. Also, I think this series does the correct pronunciation of his name, pronouncement of his name. Excuse me. I think it's the correct way to say his name. It's the way Dennis O'Neil, the creator, says it. Ra's al Ghul. But anyways, we would have Ra's showing up, Talia, and Demon's Quest, written by Dennis O'Neil, the creator. The first episode heavily referencing comics. The second episode, new thing. But again, my problem here, as with the sort of the League of Assassins, is it kind of takes Batman into a sort of more James Bondish type of thing. And to be fair, there's a little bit of Fu Manchu influence with Ra's al Ghul. And I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think Fu Manchu's daughter was kind of enamored with the main hero. Just as Talia is very enamored with Bruce Wayne. And we all know how that relationship turns out. But anyways, Dr. No is very referenced on Fu Manchu, and there were various Fu Manchu influence characters in comics, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And Ra's al Ghul definitely has that influence. His nationality is different, but again, it's still, the influence is there. Again, as I said, Talia very much pulling off from it. So that's kind of why he's not entirely my favorite Batman villain. I mean, I'm not saying I hate the character, but that's one of the things I don't entirely like. But anyways, it was nice to have his inclusion. We have, the two-part Batgirl Begins, and I believe that is actually the name of the... Oh, no, it's Shadow of the Bat. I'm sorry, it's Batgirl Begins in another series. But we have Barbara Gordon's beginning of Batgirl, and why she feels the need to become Batgirl. She would only appear twice. And early on would have one voice actress. I can't think of her name off the top of my head. And, would only appear once. In fact, Batgirl Returns, her second appearance, it would be the last we see of this type of art style for this series. And I'll get to that in a moment. Now, in June of 1995, we got in theaters Batman Forever. And again, as I was saying, here, and I'll talk about this movie later, this movie introduces to the movie audience, who may not know comics, which, believe me, the audience is there, the appearance of Robin. with Dick Grayson. So again, that's why he was appearing a lot in the animated series to gear up for this, to prepare audiences for this, and a lot of other things. And as yet, the series was not influenced by Schumacher's more neo-noir-ish, bright-colored version. It's still sticking with the Tim Burton version, and Burton did produce this movie. So as at the present, we don't get a lot of influences with the animated series. But again, we can see how the animated series is going along and preparing and coinciding with this movie. You know, preparing us with Robin episodes, his origin, having a lot more Robin in the series, and a lot of other elements. But anyways, we have that movie coming out in 95. The series would still continue on with the sort of Tim Burton style of doing things, probably because they were just in production while the movie was being filmed. And we would finally come to the end of the type of art style we see for this series of Batman, and one that I very much like here. And you see here we got Bane popping up for an episode. I would have to say, except for one radio version and Dark Knight Rises, I have not seen a lot of great Bane episodes and the cartoons and other things. Again, except for a radio show and Dark Knight Rises, there just aren't a lot of great Bane episodes, and I think I wasn't really impressed with how Bane shows up, how he's treated here. You know, to be fair, as with Doomsday, he's an event villain. So there's that aspect. But anyways, they at least have him show up. We have a new character, as we see here, of Baby Doll, and I like her first appearance. She's very well done. It's a very good story. I kind of wish they just left it at that. And we come to the end, as I said, of this style of doing the artwork. On dark paper, very stylized, very noir-ish, very in tone with 30s, 70s, and 80s, and very well done. Now, as we all know, we come to the most dreaded of Batman movies, which is Batman and Robin. And the only reason I watch this is the same reason anybody watches this, just to make fun of it. It came out in June 12th, 1997. And again, we have more of the Schumacher sort of neo-noir type of things. More flashy, more, bright colors, and a little bit more silly, and quote unquote family friendly. I'll talk about these movies more later on, and a different style of doing things than Tim Burton did. Tim Burton was trying to get away from the Adam West version of Batman. This kind of brought it right back and whatnot. So in September 13th, 1997, we get The New Adventures, which is taking its name from the second Filmation series, The New Adventures of Batman. And this would be about the same time the Superman animated series would come out and Batman would cross over with that series. World's Finest is probably the best crossover with Batman, in my opinion. And as we see here, we get a different art style, a more, they want things to conform more and, be a different style. Honestly, I am not a fan of the way this series does the artwork. We get a lot more Batgirl for this series, which, again, to pick up off of the Batman and Robin series movie, because she's part of the Batman family in this movie. She's featured heavily in the series now. Although I would argue that she's treated much better in the series, you know. So just as early episodes are taking nods from, you know, elements of Tim Burton, this series, this version, is taking nods, I feel, a lot more with Schumacher's version. So there's a lot more modern elements, a lot more, you know, a little bit less of the 30s version. Not too much, but we get a lot more modern aesthetics here. Again, the new art style, they liked it because of easier to do. Again, it's not my favorite. The storytelling was kind of off and on. One episode may be good, another not so much. We got a couple stories adapting things that were already in comics. Joker's Millions, adapting an old 40s story. We get the Mad Love story. Again, Mad Love was a comic first before it was adapted in the episode. And so the comic, which again came out, as I talked about in my All About Harley Quinn, just when the 90s series had its earlier run, and her origin had not at that time been explored on screen. And so, you know, her origin was told in comics with Mad Love first. And this is an adaptation of that comic book story. You know, it does it very briefly, quite well. Again, I would say the comic, which is more aligned artwork style with the earlier version, is slightly better in terms of looks. But, you know, this is still a good episode. We would get, you know, links with the Superman series, as I said, and, you know, a few good episodes, but there are just a lot of episodes that I didn't much care for. We get Nightwing a lot. You know, Dick Grayson now taking on that mantle. This Robin would be, you know, called Tim Drake, but in terms of character, he's very much Jason Todd. You know, a kid off the streets, taken in and adopted, and so on. So he had the Jason Todd backstory, just the Tim Drake name. And the very last episode would appear or air on October 31st, 1998. You know, so ending the, you know, quite a long run for this series. You know, starting 1992 and ending in 98. That's 7 years of this series being on the air. And again, a lot of that was reruns or repeats, but at the time we took what we could get, you know, because it's all there was. And like I said, that's just the way it was produced at the time period. So this would be the final version of this version of Batman, except for two movies, which I'll get to in a moment. And I consider, you know, these movies and the series all one thing. Now, Sub-Zero came out on VHS on March 17th, 1998. You know, just you know, someone after the series came to an end. You know, Batgirl would show up, although we concentrate a lot more on Barbara Gordon. It's probably a much better version than other movies. This is the Mr. Freeze movie we should have gotten, and I think it's his second best appearance. He would have 4 appearances. There would be Heart of Ice, a second appearance. I can't remember the episode off the top of my head where Nora is returned to him. We would have this movie, and we would have his fourth appearance, which would be in another show entirely, and I'll talk about that later. But this movie, it's very well done. I personally highly enjoyed it and thought it was quite good. And again, it's a lot better than the live-action Mr. Freeze movie we did get. Now, the final entry into this franchise would be Mystery of the Batwoman, which came out October 21st, 2003. And we got this version of Batwoman and how her origin is depicted and so on. Very highly enjoyable. We got a different actor playing Penguin. We also got Bane showing up. And so on. I should also mention with this series we get the very good episode. What was it? Was it Never Fear? It shows how, we think Batgirl's dead and, how, Batman's world is affected by that. Of course, it all turns out to be a dream. It's a very good episode, even though it's mainly dream sequence. But anyways, this would be the last one we get of solo Batman before he would go on to appear off and on in Justice League and Batman Beyond. I think it's a very good send-off for this series and version of Batman. Very well done. And, it was just enjoyable all throughout. So anyways, that's my take on my review on one of the best animated series of Batman. Hope you guys have had a great Batman day and a great weekend. Talk to you later.